Like, subscribe, and drop a comment if you're ready to step into a system that no longer exists. Because once you hear this story, you won't forget it. The sirens cut through the Melbourne night like knives. Red and blue lights bounced off wet asphalt as a lone figure sprinted through the industrial backstreets near the docks, breath tearing from his chest, shoes slipping on oil-slick pavement. Ahead of him, the Yarra River swallowed the city's reflection. Behind him, police radios crackled with one word that carried more weight than handcuffs ever could: death row. Minutes earlier, a security guard had found the body. It lay inside an abandoned rail depot scheduled for demolition, tucked between rusted carriages that still smelled faintly of diesel and iron. The victim was a corrections officer, senior rank, decades of service, left face down beneath a flickering fluorescent light. There was no sign of robbery, no sign of a struggle that made any sense. Just a set of prison keys placed carefully beside his hand, as if someone wanted them to be noticed. By dawn, the case had landed on the desk of Detective Inspector Claire Harrow. She had spent most of her career chasing people who believed the system would protect them. This case felt different. The victim wasn't just part of the system. He had helped run one of its darkest corners back when Australia still carried out executions. Harrow stood at the crime scene, her eyes fixed on the keys sealed in an evidence bag. They were old, obsolete, the kind that hadn't been used since the late 1980s, when death row was quietly erased from Australian law. Keys that should have been locked away in archives, or melted down, or simply forgotten. Instead, they were sitting beside a dead man. The victim's name was Thomas Bell. To the public, he was a retired corrections administrator. But to those who worked with him decades earlier, he was something else entirely. Bell had overseen inmates sentenced to die during the final years of capital punishment. He was known for being calm, procedural, and unshakably loyal to the rules. But loyalty had a price, and death row was where that price was paid in full. As Harrow dug into Bell's past, she discovered something unsettling. In the months before his death, Bell had been quietly meeting with journalists, lawyers, and the families of former inmates. He had requested files that were sealed, transcripts that were never meant to be reopened. He told one reporter, off the record, that Australia's death row hadn't died. It had been buried. The official narrative was simple. Capital punishment ended. The cells were emptied. The chapter was closed. But Bell's notes suggested otherwise. They spoke of transfers carried out in the dead of night, sentences quietly commuted under political pressure, and at least one execution record that didn't match any inmate on file. Harrow's team tracked Bell's final movements. On the night he died, he had visited an address in Carlton, a narrow terrace house owned by a shell company. Inside, investigators found boxes stacked floor to ceiling, prison logs, handwritten letters from condemned inmates, and photographs of a place that officially no longer existed, a secured wing beneath an old correctional facility, marked simply as Unit G. One photo stopped everyone cold. It showed a man standing behind bars, his face partially obscured by shadow, his eyes locked directly on the camera. On the back of the photo, Bell had written 3 words in tight, deliberate ink: still alive, still dangerous. There was no name, no date, just a truth that didn't fit the official record. As Harrow prepared to leave the house, a call came through from forensics. They had finished processing the rail depot. There was something else near Bell's body that hadn't been logged at first, a folded document tucked into the lining of his coat. It was a transfer order, old, stamped and signed, and at the bottom, in faded ink, was a destination that wasn't on any current map of Australia's prison system. But when they traced the suspect seen running toward the river that night, they realized something far worse. The man wasn't fleeing the crime. He was running back toward the place Bell had tried to expose. The address on the transfer order led nowhere. At least, nowhere official. The coordinates pointed to a decommissioned correctional complex just outside Ballarat, a place shuttered decades ago and left to rot behind rusted gates and overgrown fencing. Public records claimed it was stripped bare, sold off in parcels, its history reduced to a footnote. But according to the files of the late Thomas Bell, it had never truly closed. Detective Inspector Claire Harrow arrived before dawn. A thick fog hung low across the paddocks, swallowing the road and muting every sound. The main buildings loomed like concrete fossils, their windows boarded, their watchtowers empty and silent. But the perimeter lights were on. Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud, a clear sign of recent activity. Something was wrong here. Inside, Harrow and her team found signs of life where there should have been none. A low, persistent hum from a generator vibrated up from beneath the floor. A keypad, its light glowing faintly, was hidden behind a false wall. And beyond it, a stairwell descended into absolute darkness. The air grew colder with each step they took, a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. They were entering a place that wasn't supposed to exist. They called it Unit G. The cells were smaller than regulation, each one reinforced with steel that looked disturbingly newer than the rest of the crumbling complex. Cameras watched every angle, their little red lights blinking in the shadows. It was clear someone had been maintaining this place, feeding it, hiding it from the world. In the very last cell, Harrow found the man from the photograph. His name was never supposed to surface again. Evan Calder. He had been sentenced to death back in 1987 for a series of horrific murders that had terrified the state of Victoria. The case was airtight, the evidence overwhelming. The public demanded finality, a sense of closure. But then, the law changed. Executions were abolished, and Evan Calder simply vanished from the public record. Officially, his sentence was commuted and he was transferred to another facility. Unofficially, he was erased. Now, standing before Harrow, Calder looked older than his years, but his eyes were unervingly sharp, his posture calm and composed. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He just smiled, a small, knowing smile, as if he'd been expecting them all along. "They told you it ended," he said, his voice soft but carrying in the stark silence. "But systems like this don't end. They adapt." The truth unraveled fast, and it was ugly. Unit G was a legal limbo, a black site on Australian soil. It was a place for inmates deemed too dangerous to ever release, yet too politically sensitive to acknowledge. There was no death sentence here, no parole, just a permanent, state-sanctioned disappearance, authorized by classified orders and enforced by a handful of loyal, sworn-to-secrecy officials. Thomas Bell, the man whose death had started this whole investigation, had been one of them. For years, he was a part of the system, until finally, the guilt outweighed his obedience. Bell had tried to dismantle Unit G quietly from the inside, believing that simple exposure would be enough to bring it down. But Evan Calder, the prison's most infamous resident, realized that exposure meant the end of his world, the only one he had left. Bell's death wasn't an act of revenge. It was prevention, a desperate attempt to keep the secret buried. As Calder was being escorted out of Unit G, a single shot rang through the concrete corridor. Chaos erupted. One of the officers went down, not dead, but bleeding heavily. In the confusion, evidence lockers were breached. Critical files vanished. Someone had pulled the plug from the inside. Someone who knew the layout and the procedures. By the time backup finally arrived, Unit G was compromised beyond repair. Media helicopters were already circling overhead like vultures. Politicians scrambled to get ahead of the story, issuing denials and deflections. The existence of the secret facility leaked within hours, detonating across newsrooms worldwide. It was a scandal of unprecedented proportions. An inquiry followed. Then another. Names were redacted from documents. Responsibility was diluted, spread so thin it became meaningless. The system was publicly condemned in grand speeches and then quietly buried in confidential settlements. Unit G was sealed, this time for real, its entrance filled with concrete. And Evan Calder was transferred to a legitimate maximum security prison, now under the watchful eye of international scrutiny. Detective Inspector Claire Harrow testified for weeks. She told the truth as cleanly and precisely as she could, knowing full well that crucial parts of it would never be aired publicly. She watched as powerful careers ended overnight, and as other, more resilient reputations somehow survived the fallout. She watched Thomas Bell's family learn the devastating truth, that the man they loved had been both a jailer and a whistleblower, a protector and a participant in a terrible secret. 3 months later, the final report was published. The matter, it declared, was officially closed. The scandal was over. Then a body was found near the coast. The victim was a former contractor, a man with ties to the now-defunct facility. He was dead under circumstances that were eerily, chillingly familiar. There was no sign of robbery, no evidence of a struggle. And placed beside the body, carefully aligned and glinting in the light, was a set of obsolete prison keys. the kind of keys that would have been used in Unit G. Harrow read the new report in silence. Evan Calder was still in custody, locked away in a supermax prison. Unit G was gone, a concrete tomb. The system was supposed to be dead and buried. But someone else was out there. Someone who had watched, and someone who had learned exactly how it all worked. They knew how to make people disappear, and they had just learned how to keep the system alive. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for what's coming. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter. Thanks for watching.